Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. Today, the story is about James Bolden, aka Moe Joe. And Moe Joe was born in a small town in Virginia called Farmville, not to be confused with the very famous computer game. And despite its small size, Farmville was a very important spot in the fight for civil rights in Virginia. And this happened in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Hi, my name is David, and I tell stories about New York City youth gangs from the 1950s and early 1960s. And you may be wondering, but David, what does desegregation in Virginia have to do with New York City youth gangs? And the answer to that question is nothing and everything. Moe Joe was born in Farmville, as I mentioned, and he was one of 9 children. And the family lived on a 15-acre farm, and the parents, they owned a 4.5 room clapboard house, which they owned free and clear. Very good to own your own home. James's father was a very hard worker. He worked at a local box factory, and he also worked in his spare time on the farm. He literally had no time for his children because he was so busy providing for them. Now, despite what that sounds like, the family was actually close. Moe Joe's oldest sister was a nurse's aide, and then his other sister was going to Zion Bible Missionary School, and she was studying to become a Pentecostal minister. So the family loved each other, and they took an interest in each other's affairs. Speaking of affairs, Moe Joe was a student at Moton High School in Farmville, an all-black school. And Moe Joe was very good at sports. He was on the school's baseball team, basketball team, football team, and track team where he ran the 1 mile. And he was so good, he got letters in all those sports, and he was the manager of all the sports teams for the school. Now, I wasn't able to check to see if this was true or not. I don't doubt it. But Moe Joe said that he actually owned a semi-pro baseball team called the Farmville All-Stars. So I did a little poking around just to see what the situation was with his sports, to see if he was really that good. And I was very pleased to find an article from 1959, and I'm going to read this, April 1959, and it was titled Moton Tops Nelson 4-0. And the article went on to tell about how Moton Eagles beat their rivals 4-0 under some very strong pitching. But I had this line too, and I have to read this to you, it's so good. It said that the pitcher was assisted by James Bolden, who made several sparkling field plays, one of which prevented a home run. So yes, Moe Joe was very good at sports, but there was a drastic change in his life that came in September 1959. And what was it? Well, Moe Joe moved to New York City, Jamaica, Queens to be precise. He moved in with his cousin on 168th Street, which begs the question, if Moe Joe was doing so good with his sports in Farmville and everything seemed to be going good, why in the world would he move to New York City of all places? The reason why Moe Joe moved to New York City was because of school segregation in Virginia. He had just finished grade 10 and he was about to go to grade 11, but there was no school. You see, Virginia was ordered to integrate their schools, but they refused. And Prince Edward County, which is the county that Moton High School was in, the one that Moe Joe went to, refused to actually levy and collect school taxes for the 1959-1960 school year.
Prince Edward County, Virginia, the only county in America that closed its public schools rather than integrate them.
So there's actually no school. But the crazy thing is, it actually extended all the way to 1963, which just boggles the mind. And so you could just imagine the turmoil that this caused. Teachers were losing their jobs, and if families could, they would send their kids outside of state to get their schooling done, which is what Moe Joe did. But a lot of times, many kids just didn't go to school. And so Moe Joe wanted to become a phys ed teacher, and so he goes to New York City to continue his schooling in grade 11. But the funny thing is, Moe Joe didn't go to school. Well, that's not true. He only went to school for 2 months. He was a severe truant. Moe Joe's problem was he was influenced by a Queens gang called the Bishops, not to be confused with the Brooklyn Bishops, which was a totally different crew. The neighborhood that Moe Joe moved into was not exactly a very good neighborhood. It was poor. The house that he lived in with his cousin was somewhat run down and it was meagerly furnished. I mean, these weren't rich people. And the neighborhood was also known for its fair share of juvenile and adult delinquency. And so when Moe Joe moves from Farmville, he knows nobody. So he just hangs out with the boys that are on the block. The problem is those boys were in the Bishop's gang. And so Moe Joe was asked about this later, and this is what he said. And I'm going to read the quote to you in its entirety, and it gives you a little peek into how Moe Joe thinks about the situation. This is what he said. I came from the South. I didn't know better. I went with these boys. I like to hang out with the boys in my neighborhood, and when they went for a gang fight, I didn't know what it was, and I went with them. I went with the boys because otherwise, maybe they would hurt me. Anyway, I wanted to have a little fun. The problem is Moe Joe's idea of having a little fun, it went way too far on March 16, 1960. Frank Cuthbertson was a teacher and a parole officer, and he was at the Huntington Community Center in Queens, and he was acting in his capacity as a teacher to organize and run a dance. The time was 8:30 p.m. There's 50 couples on the dance floor enjoying themselves, and one of the couples wanted to be let out early. So he takes them to the exit door and he opens the door and lets them out, and he sees a major problem. Coming straight towards him is a massive group of boys, and they have bad intentions. He notices that one of them has a revolver. Later, it was found out to be a Marlin revolver, and he shoots it. Acting quickly, Frank closes the door. But before we get to the next part, we have to ask ourselves, how in the world did it come to this situation where there's dozens of boys advancing on a community center of all places? Well, to get to that, we actually have to go to the beginning to find out why. The problem was this. There was a gang feud between the Bishops, which is Moe Joe's gang, and the Cheyennes, another Queens gang. And apparently there was a party, and some Bishop Debs attended the party, and some Cheyennes were there as well. And they insulted and assaulted one of those Bishop Debs. And then they cut the hair of 3 other Debs. And I'm not talking about a good haircut. And the Queen's Bishops, they cannot let this stand. They cannot let the Cheyennes get away with this. So they decide to hold a gang council in Baisley Park. 60 guys show up. They're all milling around, and there's even some members of the infamous Brooklyn Bishops, who I mentioned before. And supposedly, some of them were armed. Anyhow, there's quite a cast of characters, and I want to read some of the nicknames in a very brief bio on some of these members of the Queen's Bishops at this council. So first of all, there was Big Shot, and he was a leader in the Bishops, and he was actually suspected by police of dealing in guns, and they suspected that he rented them out and actually got a cut of the take. Very smart and very creative, business-minded, but in the wrong way. Then there was Parks, and he was the trigger man, also a leader in the gang. Then there was Linky, and he was yet another leader in the Queen's Bishops, and he was very dangerous. In 1955, he was actually sent away for murder. And here's some of the other nicknames of some of the guys. There was Snaky, there was Mickey, there was Peanuts, Moe Joe, of course. And then there was regular old Frank Robinson. I guess he didn't have a nickname. Frank Robinson had a gun with him. Anyhow, at the council, it was decided that the Cheyennes had to be roughed up. And they knew that some of the Cheyennes were at the Huntington Community Center. So they decided to go right then. And so they're on their way to the Huntington Community Center, and some of the Bishops snap car aerials right off the vehicles parked nearby. And they're all wearing their stingy brim hats. They're all ready for war. They're armed. And as they get closer to the center, that's when Frank Cuthbertson opens the door to see them. He tries to close the door, but it wasn't enough. The Bishops kicked the door down and they overwhelmed him, and they swarmed the center. They broke windows, they broke furniture, they assaulted 3 girls, and one of them had a car aerial, as I mentioned before, and he actually hit Frank Cuthbertson on the wrist. Now, Frank didn't have to be hospitalized for this, but it took a week for the pain to die down. While all this was happening, the couples on the dance floor are thrown into complete panic. It was just total turmoil. While this was going on the inside, on the outside of the center, the rest of the bishops had surrounded it. They wouldn't let anybody leave, and they're brandishing their knives, they're brandishing car aerials. It was a very scary situation, to be honest with you. So no surprise, somebody calls the cops, and 25 cops and 9 squad cars come on the scene. And in a short amount of time, they arrested the bishops who were involved in this. And Moe Joe was one of them. This is really awful, but Moe Joe's big sister, the nurse's aide that I mentioned earlier, she was so worried sick about her brother that she actually suffered a minor heart attack, which is awful. I mean, she couldn't have been that old, probably in her 30s. And it's ironic because she's a nurse's aide. She should be helping patients, but instead she is a patient. And last summer, I walked by the hospital that she worked at, and I had no idea whatsoever that decades ago, a sister was so worried about her brother who worked there that she had a heart attack. And she wasn't the only family members that were upset. His parents were very upset and very worried for the son, and they wanted their son to come home. And this really goes to show that your actions, whether they are good or whether they are bad, they will affect those who are around you that love you. Now, I think that Moe Joe made it. He had a lot going for him, to be honest. Yes, he was sent away. Yes, he had to serve his time. But while he was on the inside, the chaplain noticed that he started reading his Bible a lot. He memorized the 10 Commandments, and he was also interested in becoming closer to God. And that was one thing going for him. Another thing going for him was that he had a family that loved him very much and wanted him back home. He also wasn't into drugs. And there's the whole sports thing. Maybe he was able to become a phys ed teacher. I know that Moe Joe wanted to move back to Farmville after he was serving his time. And I don't have proof of this, but I believe that's exactly what he did. Anyhow, we're in 1964. What's going on with the school system in Virginia? Well, the good news is the school is finally integrated. School is back on. And you know, I wonder, if the school wasn't shut down in 1959, Moe Joe wouldn't have moved to New York City. I don't see why he would. And he would have continued with his sports, maybe even graduated high school and maybe even became a phys ed teacher. And so to go back to the question I asked at the beginning of the video is, the segregation doesn't have anything to do with New York City youth gangs, but kind of does, because the segregation from that school pushed Moe Joe right into the arms of the Queen's bishops, which got him into all that trouble. Well, that brings us to the end of today's video. Thank you very much for joining me and giving me your time and watching this. And while you're here, why don't you drop a comment below and tell us what sport you played in high school. For myself, I love basketball, and in grade 9, I played 1 year of basketball, but don't get any ideas whatsoever. Not a very good player. I was what you call a bench warmer. Well, I hope you all have a great day, and we'll see you on the next video.